Eleanor was forcibly dragged by her stepmother to the royal consort selection ceremony, her sole purpose being to serve as a mere stepping stone to highlight her stepsister. When, before the eyes of the entire court and its powerful dignitaries, her stepsister viciously tore apart the gown she had painstakingly pieced together from scraps of discarded fabric, everyone assumed this pitiful illegitimate daughter would break down in tears and beg for mercy. But Eleanor shed not a single tear. Her haughty bearing and icy defiance successfully captured the attention of the empire's god of war, Harrison, the Duke of the North. This fearsome figure, whose very name struck terror into the hearts of the entire empire, disregarded the towering authority of the throne. Instead, he strode directly to the center of the great hall and draped his heavy black velvet cloak over her trembling shoulders. "Do you seek vengeance?" What he offered her was not merely a contract of marriage, but a blade, one sharp enough to topple the imperial regime itself. From a downtrodden, bullied illegitimate daughter to the unattainable queen of the North, drawing upon a supreme intellect and cunning forged in the very depths of the abyss, Eleanor systematically trampled those who had once tormented her into the mire. With the blood and tears of her enemies, she would prove this truth: those who once mocked her for having no clothes to cover her back are ultimately fit only to gaze up in despair at the throne upon which she sits. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The sound of tearing silk echoed like a gunshot through the silent marble hall. I felt a sudden, freezing draft against my bare spine. The royal bride selection was supposed to be the most elegant event of the decade. Instead, it became the stage for my public execution. My stepsister Beatrice stood right behind me. She held a jagged, torn piece of my faded blue gown in her manicured hand. She covered her mouth and gasped loudly. It was a sickeningly perfect display of fake horror. "Oh, Eleanor, whatever happened to your fragile little dress?" she asked. Her voice was laced with a cruel, undeniable victory. I stood entirely frozen under the blazing crystal chandeliers. I was never meant to be a legitimate candidate for the crown prince. My stepmother only dragged me from the estate attic to serve as a wretched contrast. They needed my poverty to make Beatrice look like a radiant goddess. They had maliciously stitched me into a dress made of brittle, discarded fabrics. I knew they wanted me to look plain. I simply did not anticipate that they planned to strip me of my dignity completely. Cold air rushed over my suddenly exposed skin. The tattered remnants of my bodice slipped dangerously low. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest in a desperate panic. I dug my fingernails into my own skin to hold the ruined fabric together. Cruel whispers erupted around me like a swarm of angry wasps. How absolutely scandalous! Is she wearing actual rags to the royal court? Throw that shameless beggar out before His Highness arrives. The aristocratic women shielded their faces with delicate painted fans. Their muffled laughter cut into my soul deeper than any physical blow. Beatrice stepped closer, her heavy perfume suffocating me. She leaned in close, her breath warm against my ear. "This is exactly where you belong, you pathetic little orphan," she whispered. "Did you really think a gutter rat could ever stand among swans?" My hands trembled violently under the harsh gaze of the nobility. Hot tears burned like corrosive acid at the back of my eyes. But I absolutely refused to let them fall. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted the sharp tang of copper. I would not give my abusers the ultimate satisfaction of my shattered composure. I forced my chin up, staring blindly at the heavy gilded doors at the end of the hall. My late mother taught me to keep my pride, even when I had nothing else left. I stood tall, though my heart beat against my ribs like a trapped bird. I silently prayed the polished marble floor would simply open up and swallow me. There was absolutely no avenue for escape. The imposing royal guards blocked every single exit. They watched my brutal humiliation with blank, uncaring faces. I was completely, utterly, and devastatingly alone. Then, a heavy, resounding crash silenced the entire room. The massive oak doors of the grand hall were violently kicked open. The arrogant, mocking whispers died in a fraction of a second. The air in the room instantly grew suffocatingly tense. Even Beatrice flinched and took a terrified step back. The torn piece of my dress slipped limply from her trembling fingers. Duke Harrison stepped slowly over the threshold. He was a man who notoriously despised and avoided these trivial court games. He was the Emperor's most feared military commander. People called him a living phantom of war and absolute power. His tall, dominant frame blocked out the soft light from the corridor behind him. He wore a pristine, pitch-black military uniform. It was adorned with heavy silver medals that gleamed like jagged ice. A magnificent, heavy velvet cloak cascaded from his broad shoulders. He did not bother to look at the ornate, empty throne. He did not spare a single glance for the terrified nobles who immediately bowed before him. His sharp, dark eyes swept the massive room like a predator. Then, his gaze locked instantly and irrevocably onto me. I completely stopped breathing. He saw my violently trembling shoulders. He saw the cruel, deliberate exposure of my ruined dress. His strong jaw tightened into a dangerous, deeply unforgiving line. The atmosphere in the hall dropped to a freezing temperature. The feared Duke of the North began to walk. His heavy leather boots echoed against the marble. It was a slow, terrifying rhythm that commanded total submission. The sea of aristocrats frantically parted ways for him. Nobody dared to breathe, let alone speak. His intense gaze never waveringly left my face. He was walking straight toward the ruined girl in the center of the room. I closed my eyes, bracing for a new wave of aristocratic cruelty. Perhaps he would be the one to order the guards to throw me into the freezing rain. Instead, the deafening silence of the grand hall stretched on. The heavy footsteps stopped just inches from where I stood. A wave of masculine scent washed over me, smelling of winter frost and dark leather. I slowly opened my eyes, looking up into a face carved from stone. There was no disgust in his dark eyes, only a quiet, burning fury directed at the crowd. He did not say a word to the trembling stepmother who had orchestrated my ruin. He simply reached up with a gloved hand and unfastened the silver clasp at his neck. The heavy silver clasp at his throat came undone with a sharp, distinct click. It was the absolute only sound in the suffocatingly silent grand hall. Duke Harrison swept the massive velvet cloak from his broad shoulders in one fluid motion. The luxurious black fabric billowed out, catching the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. Before I could even draw a nervous breath, the heavy warmth descended upon me. He draped the magnificent garment over my violently trembling, exposed shoulders. The sheer weight of the velvet was instantly grounding. It smelled deeply of winter pine, expensive leather, and a faint hint of masculine spice. The massive cloak completely engulfed my fragile frame. It easily covered the torn, shameful rags my stepmother had forced upon me. It safely hid the ugly, crisscrossing scars on my back from the cruel eyes of the nobility. For the first time all evening, I felt genuinely safe. A shocking wave of heat seeped through the thick fabric, thawing my frozen skin. I looked up, my vision slightly blurred by the unshed tears I still absolutely refused to drop. The terrifying Duke of the North was standing impossibly close to Maid. His towering frame shielded me entirely from the hostile, mocking stares of the aristocrats. He reached out toward me with a large, black-gloved hand. I instinctively flinched, bracing my body for a harsh reprimand. Instead, his touch was incredibly gentle. He meticulously adjusted the thick fur collar of the cloak around my neck. His knuckles lightly brushed against my freezing collarbone. "You are shivering," he stated simply. His deep, resonant voice vibrated clearly through the absolute silence of the room. It was not a question, nor was it a cold command. It was a simple, profound acknowledgement of my suffering. I could not find my voice to thank him properly. My throat felt completely blocked by a massive, aching lump. I merely clutched the plush edges of the cloak, pulling it tighter around my chest. Behind his broad back, the crowd finally began to recover from their initial shock. A collective, unified gasp swept rapidly through the sea of noble ladies. The Duke had just given his personal garment to a nameless, ruined girl. It was an unprecedented act of royal favor. In the rigid hierarchy of the empire, this gesture was practically a public declaration of ownership. My stepmother's face turned a horrifying shade of pale grey. Beatrice looked as though she had been physically struck across the face. Her meticulously painted lips parted in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. She could not comprehend that the evening's ultimate prize was focusing on the evening's designated victim. Jealousy instantly twisted Beatrice's beautiful features into an ugly, unrecognizable sneer. She completely forgot her place in the terrifying reputation of the man standing before her. She took a desperate step forward, her expensive silk gown rustling loudly. "Your Grace, please, you must be mistaken," Beatrice blurted out, her voice horribly shrill. "She is just Eleanor, my family's illegitimate charity case." She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "She does not deserve to wear your noble crest, for she is practically a servant." The temperature in the grand hall plummeted instantly to absolute zero. Duke Harrison slowly turned his head to look at my stepsister. He did not raise his voice at all. He did not make a sudden or threatening movement. He simply looked at Beatrice the way a predator observes a particularly annoying insect. "I did not ask for your opinion," the Duke said. His tone was dangerously soft, yet it carried clearly to every corner of the vast room. "And I certainly did not grant you permission to speak in my presence." Beatrice choked on her next words, visibly shrinking back in terror. Her arrogant facade shattered instantly under his lethal stare. "A woman who publicly tears another woman's garments is nothing but common trash," he continued coldly. "You speak of charity and status, yet you behave exactly like an uneducated brute." A brutal, mocking silence followed his devastating words. The surrounding nobles subtly but quickly shifted away from Beatrice and my stepmother. They were instantly excommunicated from high society by the Duke's simple verbal decree. Tears of sheer humiliation finally spilled down Beatrice's perfectly powdered cheeks. She collapsed entirely to her knees, completely ruined by a single sentence. The Duke casually turned his attention back to me, ignoring the sobbing woman behind him. The dangerous, icy aura around him softened the very moment his eyes met mine again. He extended his strong arm toward me, bending his elbow slightly. "The air in this hall has become foul," he murmured, his dark eyes holding mine captive. "Allow me to escort you out of this miserable place, Lady Eleanor." He called me a lady. He explicitly elevated my status above everyone else in the room with one single title. I stared blindly at his offered arm, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Taking his arm meant declaring open war on my abusive family. Taking his arm meant accepting the absolute protection of the most dangerous man in the empire. I took a deep breath, letting the clean scent of winter pine fill my lungs. I slowly raised my trembling hand and placed it lightly upon his dark sleeve. The heavy oak doors sealed shut behind us with a resounding, definitive thud. They completely severed the suffocating atmosphere of the royal hall from our new reality. My trembling hand remained lightly rested upon his dark velvet sleeve. I could distinctly feel the solid, unyielding muscle of his forearm beneath the fine fabric. We walked down the seemingly endless marble corridor in perfect, unbroken unison. His military pace was deliberately measured to accommodate my much shorter strides. The Imperial guards lining the walls snapped to immediate attention as we passed them. They actively averted their eyes out of sheer terror of the man walking beside me. The silence between us was incredibly heavy but surprisingly devoid of any malice. We finally reached the grand, arched entrance of the royal palace. A brutal blast of freezing winter wind hit my face the very moment we stepped outside. I instinctively pulled the thick edges of his heavy cloak tighter around my exposed neck. The rich, intoxicating scent of winter pine and dark leather enveloped my senses once again. A massive black carriage awaited us patiently at the bottom of the stone steps. It bore the intimidating silver crest of the Northern Duchy cast into its iron doors. For massive, restless warhorses stomped their heavy hoofs against the icy cobblestones. A uniformed driver immediately leaped down from his perch to open the carriage door. Duke Harrison stepped back slightly and politely gestured for me to enter first. I gathered the voluminous folds of the heavy velvet cloak and carefully climbed inside. The interior of the carriage was surprisingly warm and entirely devoid of ostentatious luxury. There were absolutely no frivolous silk cushions or delicate lace curtains to be seen. The wide seats were covered in practical, dark leather that smelled faintly of old parchment. The Duke climbed in securely after me, his massive frame taking up a considerable amount of space. He deliberately sat on the opposite bench, leaving a highly respectful distance between us. The carriage lurched forward smoothly, carrying us away from the glittering, toxic palace. The rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves echoed loudly through the quiet, frozen night. I leaned my tired head back against the leather seat, my mind racing with 1,000 frantic calculations. I was absolutely no longer the frightened girl trembling helplessly in the center of the royal hall. The initial paralyzing shock of my public humiliation was rapidly fading into cold, hard logic. I stared quietly at the dangerous man sitting across from me in the dim light of the carriage lantern. He was gazing passively out the small window, his sharp profile illuminated by the passing street lamps. He had just deliberately ruined his own impeccable reputation to save a nameless illegitimate daughter. He had openly and brutally insulted a powerful aristocratic family entirely on my behalf. Men of his immense political power and ruthless reputation simply did not perform random acts of charity. The feared Duke of the North did not do a single thing without a highly calculated purpose. I categorically refused to believe this was a simple, naive fairy tale rescue. I had learned the hard way long ago that every unexpected gift in this cruel world came with a hidden price. My vicious stepmother had taught me that bitter lesson through years of calculated, relentless abuse. I desperately needed to know exactly what this incredibly dangerous man wanted from me. I slowly straightened my spine, deliberately ignoring the dull, throbbing ache of the scars on my back. "Your Grace," I said softly, officially breaking the thick, observant silence of the carriage. My voice was remarkably steady, betraying absolutely none of my massive internal turmoil. He slowly turned his head away from the frosted window to look directly at me. His dark eyes were completely unreadable in the shifting, golden shadows of the interior. "You have my most profound gratitude for your unexpected intervention tonight," I continued carefully. "You saved me from a public humiliation that would have surely ended my entire life in high society." He remained completely silent, simply watching my face with an unwavering, intense focus. I took a deep, steadying breath and forced myself to hold his incredibly intimidating gaze. "However, I am not a foolish, sheltered child who believes in spontaneous miracles. I possess no personal wealth, no political backing, and absolutely no social standing whatsoever. I am merely the discarded, embarrassing secret of a family that you have just publicly destroyed. So, I must ask you a very direct and necessary question, Your Grace. Why exactly did you choose to drape your personal cloak over my shoulders tonight?" A flicker of genuine, unmasked surprise crossed his stoic features for a brief fraction of a second. It was almost immediately replaced by something that looked remarkably like deep approval. He leaned forward slightly, resting his powerful forearms casually on his knees. The dangerous, predatory aura returned instantly, but this time it was focused entirely and exclusively on me. "You are remarkably calm for a woman who was just publicly stripped and ridiculed," he noted quietly. "Most noble ladies in your exact position would be sobbing uselessly into my expensive upholstery right now." "Tears have never solved a single one of my problems in the past," I replied evenly, without missing a beat. A low, genuinely rough chuckle suddenly rumbled deep within his broad chest. It was a highly surprising sound that completely changed the harsh, unforgiving lines of his face. "You are absolutely right about one crucial thing, Lady Eleanor," he said smoothly. "I absolutely do not waste my valuable time on frivolous, meaningless acts of charity." He reached carefully into his dark uniform jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of thick parchment. He held it out slowly across the small, charged space between us. "I saved you because you are the exact, unpredictable variable I need to thoroughly disrupt the Emperor's plans. And because you happen to be the only woman in that entire hall who did not reek of desperation and deceit." I looked down at the mysterious piece of paper resting in his black-gloved hand. My pulse began to pound a new, entirely different rhythm of profound anticipation. I realized in that exact moment that my true survival was only just beginning. I reached out and took the folded parchment from his gloved hand. The thick paper carried a distinct physical weight against my freezing fingertips. I unfolded the document under the flickering amber light of the carriage lantern. The black ink formed a sharp, incredibly commanding script. This was no simple letter of introduction. It was a legally binding contract of marriage. My eyes scanned the text with sudden, razor-sharp focus. The terms laid out before me were ruthlessly pragmatic. Duke Harrison offered me his name, his absolute protection, and his wealth. In exchange, I was to act as his Duchess and a living barrier against the Emperor. The Emperor had planned to force a royal spy into the Duke's household tonight. "The Crown intended to plant Lady Genevieve in my estate," the Duke explained softly. "She has been feeding him intelligence on my military movements for over a year. Marrying her would mean sleeping with a knife constantly at my throat. By taking you instead, I forced the Emperor to reconsider his entire strategy. He cannot legally object to my choice without revealing his own hidden agenda." I absorbed this dangerous information rapidly. I understood the sheer scale of the political board we were now playing on. I was trading one form of domestic captivity for a highly volatile game of power. Yet, gazing at the iron resolve in the Duke's dark eyes, I felt a strange sense of peace. He was considered a terrifying monster to his political enemies. But right now, he was offering me a genuine, equal partnership. "This is a marriage of convenience to solve a political crisis," I stated quietly. "It is a strategic alliance," he corrected smoothly. "You need a fortress to shield you from the people who humiliated you. I need a wife who holds absolutely no loyalty to the royal court. Your stepmother has ensured that you despise the nobility just as much as I do." He leaned back against the leather cushions, waiting for my verdict. His posture held no pressure, only a quiet, terrifying patience. I looked down at the silver crest stamped at the bottom of the page. Signing this paper would sever me from my abusive past forever. It would also thrust me directly into the center of a deadly political war. But remaining a helpless victim was no longer an option I would accept. My entire life had been dictated by the cruel whims of a family that hated me. This man was offering me the power to finally control my own destiny. "What happens to my family if I agree to this proposal?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. A predatory smile touched the hard corners of his mouth. "They will learn what happens when someone touches a woman under my protection. They will be completely ruined before the sun rises tomorrow." The ruthlessness of his promise sent a dark thrill through my veins. I had spent my existence turning the other cheek in silence. Now, the most feared man in the empire was handing me a loaded weapon. "Do you have a pen, Your Grace?" I asked calmly. He produced a sleek fountain pen from his military jacket. He handed the instrument to me without a moment of hesitation. I placed the parchment flat against my knee to steady it. I signed my true name at the bottom of the contract with a firm hand. The dark ink flowed smoothly, permanently sealing my fate to the Duke of the North. I handed the pen and the document back across the carriage. He took them gracefully, his gloved fingers brushing my skin. "Welcome to the Northern Duchy, my Duchess," he murmured. The carriage began to slow down, the wooden wheels crunching loudly over gravel. We had arrived at his private estate on the outskirts of the capital. The carriage rolled to a stop, and the driver pulled open the heavy door. The stone facade of the Duke's mansion loomed against the night sky. It resembled an impenetrable military stronghold. It was undoubtedly the safest place I had ever stood. Duke Harrison stepped out into the freezing night air first. He turned around and offered me his hand. I gathered the folds of his velvet cloak and stepped down. A disciplined row of servants was lined up neatly on the stone steps. They bowed deeply as I stood beside their master. "Prepare the primary suite for my wife," the Duke ordered the head butler. The old man did not blink at the shocking announcement. "Right away, Your Grace," the experienced butler replied. The heavy oak doors swung open to reveal a magnificent, warmly lit foyer. A massive stone fireplace roared to life, banishing the winter chill instantly. The walls were decorated with ancient weapons and tapestries of forgotten battles. It was a house built for war, yet it offered a profound sense of sanctuary. The female servants stepped forward to gently take my borrowed cloak. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. I was suddenly self-conscious of my torn dress beneath the heavy fabric. The Duke noticed my immediate discomfort and raised a single hand. The servants immediately stopped and retreated to a respectful distance. "No one will see you like this," he promised quietly. "My personal tailor is already waiting in your chambers with a selection of garments." He led me up the sweeping grand staircase himself. His hand never left the small of my back. His presence formed an impenetrable shield against any lingering shame. "You will rest in my home tonight, Eleanor," he said softly. "Tomorrow morning, we will attend the royal court session together. And you will wear the most magnificent gown this empire has ever seen." I nodded silently, feeling a fierce spark of anticipation ignite in my chest. The abused, ragged girl from the royal hall was officially dead. The new Duchess of the North was ready to claim her revenge. The morning sun pierced directly through the massive stained glass windows of the royal throne room. The imperial court was already heavily buzzing with malicious gossip about the previous night's scandal. Beatrice stood proudly in the very front row alongside my fiercely smug stepmother. They both looked exceptionally pleased with their supposed social victory. I knew they fully expected me to be frozen in a gutter somewhere in the lower capital. They truly believed they had completely destroyed my entire existence. They were absolutely and catastrophically wrong. The Grand Herald struck his heavy golden staff against the polished marble floor 3 distinct times. The sharp, echoing sound demanded immediate and absolute silence from the hundreds of gathered nobles. "Presenting His Grace, Duke Harrison of the North," the herald shouted into the vast, silent room. The sea of aristocrats immediately parted like the Red Sea, bowing their heads in deep, terrified reverence. Then, the seasoned herald took a sharp, highly visible breath. His professional voice trembled slightly as he read the newly added title on his official parchment scroll. "And presenting his newly wedded wife, Her Grace, Duchess Eleanor of the North." A collective, deafening gasp forcefully ripped through the entire royal court. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock that echoed violently against the vaulted stone ceilings. I stepped through the massive golden doors with my head held incredibly high. My hand rested lightly but entirely firmly upon my powerful husband's dark velvet sleeve. I was absolutely no longer the shivering, broken girl in the ragged, patched dress. The Duke's personal tailors had worked tirelessly through the night to prepare me for this exact moment. I wore a breathtaking, perfectly tailored gown of midnight blue silk that shimmered like a starlit ocean. It was heavily and intricately embroidered with actual silver thread, forming the fierce wolf crest of the north. The cut of the dress was flawless, highlighting my youth while projecting absolute, terrifying authority. A stunning, heavy diamond necklace rested securely against my collarbone, erasing the cheap bruises of my past. My dark hair was swept up into an elegant, highly complex crown of tight braids. I looked directly at the Emperor sitting upon his elevated, heavily gilded throne. I did not blink, and I absolutely did not lower my gaze to the floor. Duke Harrison walked slowly and deliberately beside me, radiating a lethal, highly protective energy. He wore his formal black military uniform, looking exactly like a dark god of war descending upon a flock of sheep. Every single eye in the massive room was fixed entirely and exclusively upon us. I deliberately turned my head to look directly at my stepmother and Beatrice. My stepmother's face drained of every single drop of blood instantly. She looked exactly as though she had just seen a terrifying ghost rise completely from the grave. Beatrice's jaw actually dropped open, entirely destroying her carefully practiced mask of aristocratic elegance. Her eyes bulged outward with a sickening mixture of sheer panic and furious, absolute jealousy. She simply could not comprehend how the girl she had stripped and humiliated was now outranking her completely. I offered them a slow, cold, and devastatingly calm smile. It was the genuine smile of an apex predator who had finally cornered its pathetic prey. We stopped exactly 10 paces from the base of the imperial throne. Duke Harrison gave a short, incredibly crisp bow that barely registered as a legal sign of respect. I sank smoothly into a flawless, deeply calculated, and highly formal curtsy. The Emperor's face was a rigid, ugly mask of barely contained political fury. He knew instantly that his intricate, long-term plan to infiltrate the Duke's household was completely ruined. "Duke Harrison," the Emperor said aloud, his voice tight and dripping with highly toxic, false warmth. "This is certainly an unexpected and remarkably sudden development for the Empire. Love is a terribly sudden and overwhelming force, Your Majesty," the Duke replied smoothly. His deep voice was completely devoid of any actual romantic emotion. The blatant, heavily armed lie hung heavily and unchallenged in the silent, freezing air of the court. Nobody in the room dared to openly question the terrifying warlord's sudden romantic claims. "We formally registered our marriage contract at the High Temple exactly 1 hour before dawn," the Duke continued. "I simply wanted to officially introduce my Duchess to your court this morning." He gently took my hand and raised it slowly to his lips. He kissed my knuckles deliberately and possessively in front of the entire terrified Empire. The intimate gesture sent a very clear, highly lethal message to every single person in the room. I belonged entirely to him, and an attack on me was a direct act of war against the North. "However, we also come seeking immediate imperial justice," the Duke suddenly announced, dropping the polite facade. His dark eyes snapped sharply away from the Emperor and locked directly onto my violently trembling stepmother. The temperature in the throne room seemed to plummet by 20 degrees in a single, terrifying second. "Last night, an unprovoked and completely vicious assault was carried out against my future wife. Her personal garments were violently and maliciously torn by Lady Beatrice in a public setting." Beatrice let out a high-pitched, pathetic whimper that echoed clearly in the deadly silence. She violently grabbed her mother's silk arm, trying desperately to hide her body behind the older woman. "This was a direct, completely unforgivable insult to the honor and dignity of the Northern Duchy," the Duke stated coldly. "I demand that this criminal act be answered for immediately, Your Majesty." The Emperor shifted highly uncomfortably on his golden throne, completely trapped by his own rigid laws. He absolutely could not deny justice to his most powerful general without sparking an immediate, bloody civil war. The emperor looked down at Beatrice with cold eyes full of utter, political disdain. He was entirely willing to sacrifice a minor, foolish noble girl to appease the highly dangerous northern wolf. What specific form of compensation do you seek for this insult, Duke Harrison? The emperor asked tightly. The duke did not answer the sovereign directly. Instead, he slowly turned his dark, incredibly intense gaze down to me. He was publicly and deliberately handing me the heavy executioner's sword. Tell them, my Duchess, he murmured, his deep voice sending a dark thrill directly down my spine. Tell the entire court exactly what price they must pay for touching what is rightfully mine. The silence in the grand throne room was absolutely deafening as hundreds of nobles waited for my verdict. I stood perfectly still under the massive crystal chandeliers. I felt the immense, terrifying weight of absolute power resting securely in my hands for the very first time. My abusive stepmother was violently shaking from head to toe. Beatrice was openly sobbing, her expensive makeup running down her pale cheeks in ugly, dark streaks. They both looked desperately to the emperor for salvation, but the sovereign deliberately averted his gaze. He had already thrown them to the wolves to save his own political skin. I took a single, measured step forward, allowing the midnight blue silk of my heavy gown to sweep across the marble. I did not want their blood spilled upon the polished floor of the royal court. Physical violence was a highly fleeting punishment that ended entirely too quickly. I wanted to completely destroy the very foundation of their arrogant, cruel existence. I do not seek a public execution for this crime, Your Majesty, I stated clearly, my voice ringing out with absolute certainty. A collective, highly audible sigh of relief swept instantly through the ranks of the terrified aristocracy. They foolishly believed I possessed a soft, forgiving heart. They simply did not understand the deep, freezing depths of my forged hatred. Death is a mercy reserved for honorable enemies, I continued coldly, freezing the room once again. Lady Beatrice and her mother possess absolutely no honor whatsoever. They worship nothing but their wealth, their titles, and their falsely elevated social standing. Therefore, I demand that those exact things be stripped from them entirely and permanently. I locked my gaze directly onto my stepmother's horrified, widening eyes. I demand that their aristocratic titles be officially revoked by the crown this very morning. I demand that their entire family estate, all their lands, and their hidden vaults be immediately seized by the imperial treasury. And I demand that they be permanently banished to the lowest, poorest district of the capital city. They will learn to survive as the penniless commoners they so deeply and violently despise. Beatrice let out a blood-curdling, agonizing scream of pure, unadulterated terror. No! You cannot do this to us, Eleanor, she shrieked hysterically, thrashing wildly against her mother's grip. We are high-born ladies of the court. You are high-born, Duke Harrison corrected her brutally, his dark voice slicing through her pathetic screaming. Now, you are entirely nothing. The emperor gripped the golden armrests of his throne so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He hated being dictated to in his own royal domain. However, he looked at the imposing, heavily armed figure of the northern duke standing protectively at my side. The emperor knew he had absolutely no choice but to completely submit to our demands. The crown finds this punishment highly appropriate for the severe insult delivered to the northern duchy, the emperor declared stiffly. Let the official decree be written and executed immediately. 2 heavily armored royal guards instantly stepped forward and grabbed Beatrice by her trembling arms. She fought them like a cornered, rabid animal, her expensive silk dress tearing in the violent struggle. A 3rd guard roughly seized my stepmother, ignoring her desperate, breathless pleas for royal mercy. My stepmother fell directly onto her knees, the heavy velvet of her gown pulling around her in a pathetic heap. She reached out a trembling hand toward the throne, desperately seeking a lifeline that simply did not exist. Your Majesty, I beg of you, consider our long history of absolute loyalty to the crown, she pleaded openly. Her voice was completely stripped of its usual arrogant, biting edge. My husband died fighting for your father's royal army in the southern campaigns. You cannot throw his widow and legitimate daughter into the filthy slums like common criminals. The emperor looked down his aristocratic nose at her with a highly practiced expression of complete boredom. Your loyalty ended the exact moment your daughter assaulted a ranking Duchess of the North, the sovereign stated coldly. You are incredibly fortunate that Her Grace did not demand your immediate beheading on this very floor. Guards, remove this offensive trash from my sight before I entirely lose my patience. They systematically and efficiently stripped the heavy gold necklaces and jeweled rings directly from the screaming women. The royal guards tossed the confiscated jewelry carelessly onto the cold marble floor at the emperor's feet. The sharp, metallic clatter echoed like a final, devastating death knell for my former family. They were aggressively dragged backward out of the grand throne room, kicking and sobbing uncontrollably. Their frantic screams slowly faded down the long, echoing stone corridors until total silence returned. The heavy iron doors of the great hall slammed shut with a final, echoing boom, sealing their dark fate forever. The entire assembly of the empire's most powerful nobles watched the brutal social execution in absolute, paralyzed horror. Nobody dared to whisper a single word of protest or pity. They all understood the lethal new reality of the royal court perfectly. The abused, forgotten illegitimate daughter was now the most untouchable woman in the entire empire. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling an incredible, unprecedented lightness expand in my chest. The dark, suffocating shadow of my miserable childhood had just been permanently eradicated. Duke Harrison stepped slightly closer to me, his broad shoulder brushing reassuringly against mine. I looked up at his handsome, deeply scarred face. There was a distinct, undeniable gleam of profound respect shining in his dark, predatory eyes. You executed that perfectly, my Duchess, he murmured softly, so only I could hear. You destroyed their entire world without ever dirtying your own hands. I merely gave them the exact life they always intended for me, I replied quietly. The Duke offered a slow, incredibly dangerous smile that promised further absolute devastation to our enemies. He offered me his arm once again in front of the entirely silent, highly terrified royal court. Our business in this miserable place is officially concluded, he announced loudly to the rigid emperor. We will return to the north immediately to prepare for the upcoming winter. We turned our backs entirely on the most powerful man in the empire without waiting for his royal dismissal. We walked proudly out of the grand throne room, leaving a completely shattered political landscape in our wake. I was leaving the toxic, abusive prison of my youth entirely behind me. I was walking bravely toward a harsh, frozen land and a highly complicated marriage of political convenience. But for the very first time in my entire existence, I was walking completely free. The journey to the remote northern duchy lasted for 3 grueling, bone-chilling weeks. The comfortable green valleys of the southern capital quickly disappeared completely behind us. They were systematically replaced by an unforgiving, infinitely expanding landscape of jagged ice and dark stone. The temperature dropped steadily and mercilessly with every single passing mile. The interior of our reinforced carriage grew constantly colder despite the heavy thermal blankets. I completely refused to complain about the harsh, freezing conditions. I sat up perfectly straight on the leather bench for hours on end. Duke Harrison watched my silent endurance with a highly calculating, unreadable expression. He clearly expected me to break down and demand to return to the luxurious capital. He simply did not fully understand the vast, dark depths of my forged resilience yet. I would eagerly freeze to death before I ever returned to my abusive, pathetic past. Finally, the massive, imposing silhouette of Iron Reach Fortress emerged directly from the raging blizzard. It was absolutely not a beautiful, delicate palace of painted glass and gold. It was a brutal, indestructible military stronghold carved entirely into the side of a frozen mountain. Massive iron gates swung open with a deafening, terrifying metallic groan. Our exhausted horses dragged the heavy carriage slowly into the heavily fortified central courtyard. Hundreds of battle-hardened northern soldiers stood perfectly at attention in the freezing snow. They completely lacked the refined, colorful, and utterly useless uniforms of the royal court guards. These dangerous men wore practical, heavy animal furs and badly scarred leather armor. They stared at our arriving carriage with eyes full of deep, unconcealed hostility. The carriage driver quickly pulled open the heavy wooden door. The brutal northern wind hit my unprotected face like a solid wall of freezing iron. Duke Harrison stepped out first into the raging, relentless storm. He turned around and offered me his large, highly capable hand. I grasped it firmly and stepped down securely onto the packed, treacherous ice. I did not slip, and I absolutely did not shiver in front of his watching, judgmental army. A tall, severely scarred man stepped forward aggressively from the rigid ranks of the soldiers. He possessed a thick, graying beard and eyes as intensely hard as polished flint. This was Commander Thorne, the Duke's most trusted military advisor and the Castellan of Iron Reach. He gave a stiff, highly reluctant bow that barely acknowledged my physical presence. "Welcome home, Your Grace," Commander Thorne barked loudly over the howling, violent wind. He completely ignored me and addressed his towering master directly. "We absolutely did not expect you to return with a fragile southern liability in tow." His blatant, unapologetic insult echoed clearly across the silent, intensely watching courtyard. He deliberately wanted to publicly humiliate me and test my breaking point immediately. He firmly believed I was just another useless, pampered spy sent by the treacherous emperor. I felt the Duke tense slightly beside me, preparing to intervene lethally on my behalf. I immediately squeezed his dark sleeve, silently demanding that he stand down completely. I absolutely had to fight this particular political battle entirely on my own. If I hid weakly behind my powerful husband now, the North would never truly respect my authority. I released the Duke's arm and took 2 deliberate, highly aggressive steps toward Commander Thorne. The fierce wind violently whipped my dark velvet cloak around my freezing ankles. I tilted my chin up and locked my gaze directly onto the scarred veteran's hard, dismissive eyes. "I am not a fragile liability, Commander," I stated clearly. My voice was remarkably steady and carried perfectly over the raging winter storm. "And I am certainly not a pathetic southern spy sent to weaken your military defenses." Commander Thorne scoffed openly, crossing his massive, muscular arms over his heavy armored chest. "Southern words are incredibly cheap, little lady," he sneered dismissively at me. "The North crushes weak, soft things without a single ounce of mercy." I did not flinch away from his highly aggressive, overt physical intimidation. Instead, I boldly closed the remaining distance between us, entering his personal space entirely. "Then it is incredibly fortunate that I was forged in a fire far hotter than your pathetic winter," I replied coldly. "I survived 2 agonizing decades of relentless starvation, severe psychological abuse, and political betrayal. I successfully navigated the deadliest royal court in the empire and completely ruined my enemies before breakfast." I pointed a completely steady, unwaveringly firm finger directly at his scarred chest plate. "Do not ever mistake my lack of physical muscle for a lack of absolute, terrifying ruthlessness, Commander. I am the Duchess of the North now, by the strict legal decree of your own master. You will address me with the exact level of formal respect that my title legally demands. If you deliberately disrespect me again, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of this brutal winter scrubbing the latrines." A heavy, incredibly tense silence instantly fell over the entire crowded, freezing courtyard. The hardened, dangerous soldiers stared at me in absolute, unadulterated shock. Nobody had ever dared to speak to the fearsome Commander Thorne with such aggressive, commanding authority. I held my ground perfectly, absolutely refusing to break eye contact with the towering military man. For 10 agonizing seconds, the violent tension in the freezing air was completely suffocating. Then, a highly unexpected, genuinely booming laugh erupted violently from Commander Thorne's chest. The harsh, barking sound echoed loudly against the high stone walls of the fortress. The deep hostility in his flinty eyes vanished completely, replaced by a sudden spark of profound respect. He immediately uncrossed his massive arms and offered me a sweeping, undeniably sincere bow. "My deepest, most profound apologies, Your Grace," Commander Thorne announced loudly to the entire courtyard. "It appears the Duke has finally brought us a woman with actual, unbreakable iron in her spine. Welcome to Iron Reach, Duchess Eleanor." The surrounding soldiers instantly slammed their heavy wooden spears against their iron shields in a unified, deafening salute. The rhythmic, thundering sound was a highly primitive but entirely genuine display of absolute acceptance. I had successfully passed the brutal, unforgiving entry test of the northern military ranks. I slowly turned my head to look back at Duke Harrison standing near the heavy carriage. His dark eyes were blazing with a fierce, unmistakable mixture of deep pride and highly potent desire. He stepped forward rapidly and placed his heavy, warm hand securely upon the small of my back. "Let us go inside the fortress, my Duchess," he murmured warmly, his breath tickling my ear. "The real work of ruling this territory begins tomorrow." The bitter northern winter arrived with unprecedented, terrifying speed. Iron Reach Fortress was completely buried under several feet of solid, unyielding snow within a single week. The heavy oak doors of the central war room slammed shut, sealing us inside against the freezing drafts. Duke Harrison stood aggressively over a massive, heavily worn map of the Empire. Commander Thorne paced the stone floor like a highly agitated, highly dangerous wolf. "The final 3 grain caravans from the southern provinces have completely vanished," Thorne reported grimly. "Our scouts found the supply wagons burned to ashes and the civilian drivers slaughtered in the snow. The Emperor officially blames roaming bandits for the devastating loss of our crucial winter supplies. We all know those non-existent bandits are heavily armed royal soldiers in disguise. The Emperor was executing a cowardly, silent siege to brutally starve the Northern Duchy into submission. Without those massive grain shipments, the fierce Northern army would severely weaken before the spring thaw." Duke Harrison slammed his heavy fist violently onto the wooden table, instantly cracking the thick timber. "I will ride south with the vanguard cavalry and personally slaughter the blockade tonight," the Duke growled dangerously. "That is exactly the foolish trap the Emperor desperately wants you to trigger," I stated clearly from the shadows. Both hardened military men stopped entirely and looked at me in stark, unadulterated surprise. I stepped confidently out from the dark corner of the war room into the flickering candlelight. I walked purposefully toward the massive wooden table, ignoring the intense tactical tension in the air. I pulled my heavy velvet shawl tighter around my shoulders against the creeping draft. "If you attack royal soldiers, even disguised ones, you legally declare open, unprovoked treason," I explained calmly. "The Emperor will instantly have the political justification to mobilize the entire imperial army against the north. He will publicly frame you as the irrational aggressor and completely isolate us from any potential allies. We cannot simply let our loyal people starve to death in the snow, Your Grace," Thorne argued heavily. "The men are fiercely loyal, but starvation inevitably breeds deadly, uncontrollable mutiny." I looked down at the sprawling map, tracing the intricate ink lines of the southern borders with my finger. "My stepmother's family maintained massive, highly illegal wealth by systematically avoiding imperial trade taxes," I revealed quietly. "I was forced to secretly audit their heavily coded financial ledgers for 10 miserable, agonizing years. They utilized a highly secretive network of river smugglers operating entirely outside royal jurisdiction. I know the exact locations of their hidden docks and the private cipher codes they use to communicate." I grabbed a piece of charcoal and quickly marked 3 specific, unmarked points along the winding eastern river. The royal blockade is heavily concentrated on the main imperial highways and the prominent mountain passes. They completely ignore the frozen marshlands surrounding the eastern riverbanks. If we promise these smugglers exclusive, tax-free access to the northern markets next spring, they will deliver our grain. They possess shallow river barges that can easily bypass the Emperor's heavy land blockade entirely in the dark. I can personally forge the necessary ciphered letters to guarantee their immediate, unquestioning cooperation. We silently solve the catastrophic supply crisis without spilling a single drop of northern blood. We instantly defeat the Emperor's cowardly siege while legally maintaining the perfect illusion of peace. The imposing war room fell into a stunned, incredibly profound silence. Commander Thorne stared at the newly marked map with wide, completely disbelieving eyes. He looked up at me with an expression of absolute, bordering on religious, military awe. "I will dispatch the Shadow Riders to these exact coordinates immediately, Duchess," Thorne said respectfully. "I will have the fastest couriers ready to deliver your ciphered letters before midnight strikes." He grabbed the charcoal-marked map and quickly hurried out of the heavy iron doors without another word. The sudden departure left the Duke and me entirely alone in the massive, dimly lit room. The roaring fire in the stone hearth crackled loudly in the heavy, highly charged silence. Duke Harrison slowly walked around the cracked wooden table directly toward me. His dark eyes were blazing with a terrifyingly intense, highly consuming heat. He stopped mere inches from my face, his towering frame completely blocking out the rest of the room. "You just saved my entire army with a piece of charcoal and your abusive family's dirty secrets," he murmured huskily. "You flawlessly outsmarted the Emperor's entire military council in exactly 3 minutes." He reached out slowly and gently cupped the side of my face with his large, heavily calloused hand. His touch was remarkably tender for a man who had slaughtered hundreds of enemies on the brutal battlefield. "I married you to serve as a convenient political shield against the treacherous crown," he confessed deeply. "I completely underestimated the lethal, brilliant weapon I actually brought into my home. You are a terrifyingly magnificent creature, Eleanor." My heart pounded a frantic, entirely new rhythm against my tight rib cage. I did not pull away from his intense, highly intoxicating physical proximity. "We are equal strategic partners, Harrison," I whispered softly, using his given name for the very first time. "I fiercely protect what is rightfully mine, and this territory currently belongs to us." His thumb slowly traced the line of my jaw, sending violent shivers straight down my spine. "You are absolutely mine," he declared fiercely, his deep voice vibrating through my very bones. "And I belong entirely to you." He lowered his head and captured my lips in a sudden, highly possessive kiss. There was absolutely no hesitation, no gentle preamble in his forceful, utterly consuming claim. It was a brutal, incredibly passionate collision of two fiercely independent souls. I gasped into his mouth, instantly tangling my hands deeply into his dark, thick hair. The clean scent of winter pine and raw masculine energy completely overwhelmed my senses. He wrapped his powerful arms tightly around my waist, lifting me effortlessly off the cold stone floor. I pressed my body securely against the hard, unyielding muscle of his chest. The lingering shadows of my traumatic past completely evaporated in the blinding heat of his absolute devotion. We were no longer just a desperate survivor and a calculating warlord bound by a cold legal contract. We were highly lethal equals, perfectly matched to conquer the entire corrupt empire together. The Emperor had foolishly tried to break our stronghold, but he had only forged our absolute unity. The brutal winter finally broke, giving way to a fierce, unstoppable northern spring. The melting snows revealed an army that had absolutely not starved, but had grown incredibly strong. We did not wait for the treacherous Emperor to make another cowardly, desperate move against us. Duke Harrison officially mobilized the full, terrifying, and perfectly supplied might of the Northern Army. I absolutely refused to remain hidden safely behind the impenetrable stone walls of Ironreach Fortress. I rode proudly and openly beside my powerful husband on a magnificent, towering black warhorse. I wore a custom suit of dark leather armor, heavily and intricately embroidered with the silver wolf crest. We marched relentlessly south, leading 50,000 battle-hardened soldiers directly toward the corrupt capital. The emperor had foolishly and arrogantly believed his silent starvation tactics had successfully destroyed our forces. He was completely, catastrophically unprepared for our rapid, overwhelming, and highly organized arrival. We reached the heavily gilded gates of the imperial city just as the morning sun crested the horizon. The cowardly, severely underpaid royal guards instantly dropped their weapons without firing a single, defensive arrow. They took one terrified look at the massive northern vanguard and immediately opened the heavy city gates. We rode directly and confidently through the winding, panicked cobblestone streets of the capital. The rhythmic, thundering sound of 50,000 marching boots echoed against the buildings like a devastating earthquake. We deliberately navigated our massive military procession through the poorest, most wretched district of the lower city. I turned my head slightly and noticed two filthy, completely unrecognizable women digging desperately through a muddy gutter. They were frantically fighting feral street dogs for moldy, completely discarded scraps of stale bread. Beatrice and my former stepmother slowly looked up at the magnificent procession in sheer, unadulterated terror. Their hollow, violently sunken eyes widened in absolute, soul-crushing despair. They finally recognized the powerful, highly respected woman leading the conquering army from the very front. I did not even spare them a second, pitiful glance as my massive warhorse marched directly past their miserable existence. Their ultimate, inescapable punishment was simply living long enough to witness my absolute, undeniable triumph. We arrived at the Grand Plaza directly in front of the primary royal palace without shedding a single drop of blood. The heavy golden doors of the Grand Hall were violently kicked open for the very last time. It was the exact same marble room where I had been brutally stripped, mocked, and humiliated just months ago. The corrupt emperor was cowering pathetically on his elevated, heavily gilded throne. His elaborate silk robes were deeply wrinkled, and his jeweled crown sat highly crookedly on his sweating, trembling head. He frantically attempted to negotiate a cowardly, desperate peace treaty with the man he had secretly tried to murder. Duke Harrison completely ignored the babbling, highly pathetic sovereign pleading for his miserable life. He drew his massive silver broadsword, the heavy, lethal blade gleaming brightly in the morning light. He did not shout, nor did he make a wildly aggressive scene in front of the terrified, captive court. He simply pointed the sharp tip of the lethal blade directly at the emperor's violently trembling throat. He demanded the emperor's immediate, unconditional, and permanent abdication of the imperial crown. The emperor, openly weeping and shaking uncontrollably, signed the official surrender documents without a single argument. The corrupt, abusive empire was completely dismantled in a single, highly efficient, and absolutely bloodless afternoon. Duke Harrison did not take the tainted, arrogant golden throne for his own personal glory. He immediately ordered his loyal soldiers to completely dismantle the ugly, gilded chair into useless, shattered firewood. We were absolutely not going to rule our people from a toxic city built entirely on deception, cruelty, and aristocratic vanity. We would rule the newly unified territories directly from the unbreakable, brutally honest stone walls of the north. Harrison slowly sheathed his heavy sword and turned his entire, undivided attention directly to me. The harsh, unforgiving light of military victory shining in his dark eyes softened instantly into profound, absolute devotion. He reached out and gently pulled me flush against his solid, heavily armored chest. "The entire world is finally yours, my magnificent Duchess," he whispered deeply, his warm breath brushing against my lips. "We conquered it entirely together, my Duke," I replied softly, resting my hands firmly against his broad shoulders. I looked out over the massive, fiercely loyal army that now belonged entirely and unquestionably to us. I had started this deeply perilous journey as a broken, shivering girl trapped in a torn, deliberately ruined dress. I was permanently ending it as the most powerful, fiercely protected, and unconditionally loved woman in the known world. The abused, terrified orphan from the dusty attic was completely and permanently dead. The immortal, absolutely untouchable Queen of the North had officially and gloriously risen.